Well, it's 4 o'clock. Would anybody be willing to pray for us? Someone who hasn't maybe gotten the chance yet?
Pam?
Pam doesn't do that. Is there somebody who does?
I think I can pray.
Okay, thanks, Kathy.
God, thank you for your word and the fellowship that we get to have with each other. Please bless this time that we would grow to love your word more and to hear you in it.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay. Well,
I asked for finding my file folder that I've been looking for 2 weeks.
Oh
That
no.
would be what I would pray for.
Okay. Help her find her file folder, please, Lord.
I'll offer to help.
So let's start in chapter 23. We're not going to really settle here for very long. This is the story of Sarah's death, and then Abraham's kind of settling with a local person, a local Canaanite, a Hittite, to bury her in Machpelah. And so I thought I would just quickly remind us of our geography lesson that we had. And I've got one map over here, but let me pull up this one. I had it pulled up. So on this map, here's the land of Israel. Here's the promised land. Let's see. We'll do... Okay, so it has the story because I had chosen it a minute ago. This is where... Let me just make it easier for you to see. So here we are. This is Israel over here. This is the Mediterranean Sea in this corner. And so this is kind of southern Israel down here. This is northern Israel up here. And Abraham, at the beginning of the story, at the beginning of chapter 23, he is down here way in the south in Beersheba. And when she dies, they go up to Machpelah. And that's where he, at least if I'm remembering correctly, I didn't actually refresh my beginning of this. Sorry, I'm just double checking that it doesn't really matter where he was. Point is, he goes up to Machpelah, which is by Hebron. And Hebron is actually a really significant city in the biblical narrative. Do you know what else it's associated with? Or anybody?
David?
It's associated with David. David, how so?
Just read something about it. Is he anointed there?
Oh, I can't remember if he's anointed there. He definitely becomes king of Hebron before he becomes a king of Israel. So remember, the first king of the United Kingdom of Israel was Saul. Saul then tries to kill David for a long time. Finally, Saul dies in battle, and David becomes king. But first, he becomes king in Hebron, I believe, for 7 years. And that's not very far from Jerusalem. Maybe I can show you another map in a little bit. Yeah, it's not really clear. On this map, Jerusalem is right there, and Hebron is right there, right next to it, but it's just kind of hard to see. So David becomes king in Hebron first, then Jerusalem, and that's over all of Israel. But also, when these spies go out the Israelites are traveling through the wilderness with Moses, and Moses sends out 12 spies. And only 2 people come back with a favorable report saying that they can take the land, right? And everybody else says, no, the land is filled with giants. They'll kill us. And so God gets really mad and makes them wander in the wilderness for another 40 years. But the 2 who come back with a favorable report, who are faithful, are, do you remember who they are? Caleb and Joshua. Joshua was the assistant to Moses, and Caleb was just, I believe he was a Judahite. He was from the tribe of Judah. And so he and Joshua are, if I remember correctly, the only people who survive the wilderness journey and get to cross into the promised land. And when they then come, Caleb gets the city of Hebron. Mm-hmm. So And I'm sure there's way more significance to it. But just remember, Hebron is a relatively significant place in the history of Israel. I bet you if we did an in-depth study on it, we would find New Testament stories associated with it. Okay, so at this point in the story, at the beginning of chapter 23, we're in the Promised Land, but Abraham and his people don't own any land. By the end of this chapter, he owns land in the Promised Land, right? Because he buys this area around this cave near Hebron, and that's in the Promised Land. So this is the first time in the story that we have concrete evidence of God's promise. You know, this is one of the first stages of fulfillment of God's promise that they'll get this land. And that's most of what I wanted to say. The Hittites, it refers to the Hittites. He buys it. This whole conversation happens between him and the Hittites. The Hittites were a particular ethnic group, as I understand it, associated with what used to be, I don't know in how much before Abraham's lifetime, but was a huge empire. The Hittite Empire, I believe, I could be wrong about this, but I believe it was in the north. Let me see if any of these... Okay, so it already has a map of Abram being in Hebron earlier in the story, which tells me this has already been significant in the story of Genesis. But let me see... Let me see if these 4 kings maps might show us the empires. It does, but it doesn't show us the Hittite Empire. But I believe the Hittite Empire was up here in the north. So anyways, Canaan was a mixed ethnic area. Remember, we talked about how because this was a fertile region and down here in Egypt was a fertile region because of the delta, people never crossed this way. This is all desert. It's all deadly land. So people, if you were over here and you're wanting to go down to Egypt, you'd have to go all the way up here, follow the rivers, and come down here. Same thing if you were in Egypt and you were wanting to go anywhere up here or over here. And so Canaan was this kind of classic middle ground where all the trade happened and people met in between. So it makes sense that Canaan as a land was filled with all kinds of different ethnic groups. So it's always been a territory that people have kind of fought over, and it's still that today. Yeah. So that's probably all that I want to say about chapter 24. Is there any questions that you have about that chapter?
About 24?
Or 23, I'm sorry.
23.
I was looking at 24 when I said that. Okay. Well, this video I do think is kind of helpful for us getting a biblical understanding of...
If you go out into a desert,
Okay, it's going to
you'll
start.
see
This is going to give us, help us understand the biblical imagination around water, the role that water plays throughout Old and New Testament.
If you go out into a desert, you'll see why it's one of the most deadly, uninhabitable places on the planet. It's dry, and where there's no water, there's no life.
This is the picture that we get on page 2 of Genesis. The story begins with a dry and desolate wilderness. But God provides a spring in the desert that becomes a source of life for plants and animals.
And that's where God brings together a man and a woman, so that humanity can flourish and spread the life of the garden.
Exactly. And that garden spring becomes a river that flows out to water the entire world. And there can be enough for everyone. It's all a gift from God.
And this is great, humans in a lush garden, but as it turns out, they find a way to ruin it.
Right. Despite all of this water that God's provided, it's like they still have a drought deep inside of them. This is an image of the human condition, how we're always thirsty for more.
But more of what?
Well, in this story, the humans want more wisdom to create more security and more control on their own terms. And tragically, it only leaves them more thirsty and suspicious of each other, and so they end up back in the wilderness.
The humans have lost access to the water of life.
And because of that, they can't spread God's life into the world.
And so God needs to rescue them from the wilderness.
Yeah, like in the story of Jacob. His selfish scheming ruined his family relationships, so he has to run from his problems out into the wilderness. But there, he finds a well, and he meets a woman.
And this is like Eden, a man and a woman together by a source of water.
Right. And then through Jacob, God creates the family of Israel. And he invites them to share in his own life so that they can be his partners in spreading that life to others. And sometimes they do this.
But ultimately, they struggle with the same drought of the soul, thirsting for more power and more control, and it leads them down a path of violence and self-ruin.
And so they find themselves in a new wilderness, captive to other nations.
All this effort to quench our own thirst on our own terms, it's killing us.
Yeah, the biblical prophet Ezekiel described Israel in exile as a pile of dry bones, scattered in a desert valley. But, he said, one day God will pour out his own life presence, his spirit, to water the land, to create a new Eden and new kinds of humans.
People who can spread God's life to others.
Exactly. And so this brings us to the story of Jesus.
Right. And there's a story about Jesus who goes to a well that Jacob used to own.
And just like in Jacob's story, Jesus meets a woman. And he tells this woman that no matter how much water she drinks from this well, she'll always thirst for more. Then he offers water that could quench her thirst forever.
He's not talking about the well water.
No, what he's talking about is God's own life that comes through him to us to satisfy our deepest thirsts. This is why later on Jesus says, "Let anyone who's thirsty come to me and drink."
This is cool. But it's also a strange image, drinking from a person.
Totally. And it's connected to another strange image we find in the story of Jesus' death on the cross.
A Roman soldier thrusts a spear in Jesus' side, and there's blood. But also, all this water flows out.
Yes, it's an image showing how Jesus' death is the fountain of life. From him, God's own love that would die for his enemies flows down and out into the world.
After Jesus was raised from the dead, we're told that he sends the Spirit into his followers.
Yes, to fill them up with God's own life. This is why the Apostle Paul said that when we join the current of God's Spirit, the fruit of Eden starts growing in us. Love and joy, patience and kindness, gentleness and self-control.
People like that can create beautiful things in the world that bring life to others.
Yes, like little streams of God's life that can come together and point forward to the beautiful scene that we find on the last page of the Bible.
There's a new river of life.
Yes, it's flowing out from God and into a renewed creation, bringing life to all wherever it goes.
Okay. Don't worry if that was too much too fast. The main points are to help you realize that in many ways the Bible starts with this picture. There's two kind of depictions of the creation, Genesis 1 and then there's Genesis 2 and 3. And in Genesis 2 and 3, the basic idea is that it kind of sounds like a wilderness because there's such this focus on water springing up from the ground and watering the earth, and then wherever the water goes, vegetation growing. So this image is played on all throughout the Bible of the wilderness and God bringing life to the wilderness through water. We actually read that today in Isaiah. I don't know if you remember that in the service. God made a promise through Isaiah that he would pour out water in the wilderness, and even the jackals would praise God because he made the desert a place to live. But part of what I wanted you to see that video for was to realize that almost anytime you see water in the story of the Bible, it's significant. It's rarely just some, random part of the story. It's normally, it's real, and it's showing you, it's symbolizing that something life-giving is happening. If you go through Genesis and you track anytime water is mentioned or a well, it's often nearby at the mention of God's blessing. Because wherever the water goes, life comes, right? And the blessing of God for his people is that they will multiply. Life will happen. When people are blessed by God, life multiplies. So you see why water, wherever water goes, life multiplies. Wherever God's blessing is, life multiplies. And so actually, today in chapter 24 is our first well story, but it's the first of two major stories where one of the patriarchs meets a woman at the well. They only mention Jacob in the video, but actually the first is Isaac. Well, not Isaac. Actually, it's Eliezer. It's the servant of Abraham. But a man meets a woman at a well, and something amazing happens. Something that shows God's blessing. So when you read that story in John chapter 4, and Jesus encounters the woman at the well, if you are a student of the Old Testament, you're going, a man meeting a woman at the well, what's about to happen? God's blessing is about to happen. So, okay, chapter 24, we're not going to read the whole thing. It's actually one of the longer chapters in Genesis. Did you have any questions or anything you noticed in the story of the servant meeting the Rebecca at the well before we start on it? Okay, well, if you have any questions or notes, let me know. In verse 1, it says that Yahweh, or the Lord, in all caps, had blessed Abraham in all things. So it's reiterating, reminding us of God's promise to Abraham that he would bless him, right? That was the beginning of the Abraham story in chapter 12. I will bless you, and through you all the nations of the world will be blessed. So it starts by reminding us Abraham is blessed, and he's blessed in all things. In fact, in chapter 23, when Abraham was buying that field for Sarah, when he approached the Hittites to start making the deal with them, in, chapter 23, verse 6, the Hittites answered Abraham, "Hear us, my lord, you are a mighty prince among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our sepulchres." So Abraham, we already know that Abraham's blessed. He's got all this family by this point in the story. And even the other people around him recognize, you're a prince among us. You've got power. God's blessing is on you. And so in chapter 24, it starts out by reminding us of that blessing. And then we have the scene with his servant. And we assume, I believe it says, Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his house. So earlier in the story, remember, we were introduced to, I think it was in chapter 15, Abraham kind of complains to God, and he says, at this point, if I die, the heir of my house will be my servant, Eliezer of Damascus, so no biological relation. And God said, he's not going to be your heir. So in this story, Abraham finally has his heir. Who is his heir?
Isaac.
Isaac is his heir. And he's sending Eliezer, who would have inherited everything, to go and find a wife for his son. Now, this is kind of a side question, but how do you think Eliezer felt when he was like, he had it made? The guy was 100 years old. He was surely going to die, and then Eliezer was definitely going to get all of the inheritance. And not only is this great thing thwarted, he doesn't inherit all these riches from this prince, basically, Abraham. He has a child, impossibly. And then he's sent on the task to go find a wife for the heir that supplants him. You think Eliezer's excited? I don't know. I mean, actually, I think in the story, he seems pretty willing and obedient.
It depends on how greedy he was in the first place.
Right.
I mean, he was always a servant.
Right.
It would have been very unusual for him to actually inherit.
Yeah. Yeah. So, we're not given any indication. The story isn't about that. The story doesn't care to tell us whether Eliezer is upset, or he seems pretty obedient, and he seems very devoted to his task. So at the very least, it doesn't show any resentment or anger over it. But I think it's okay for us to ask that kind of question, because it helps us really interact with the text. As long as we're clear, it's obvious that the text doesn't want to tell me the answer. That's not a major point of this story. So Abraham makes Eliezer swear to him an oath. He's making a covenant with Eliezer. We talked about making covenants. They make this deal. And did you notice the weird thing that they do, weird to us. How do they make the covenant?
Put your hand under my thigh.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure thigh is kind of code for what we don't want to talk about, right? It's in a place that we don't, because, I mean, and this is something that scholars agree with. This is not a sexual thing, but it, you know, like, I don't want to get graphic, or the point is, it's in that general area. And that is where descendants and blessing come from. That is where God's blessing comes through. So this is an errand he is being sent on to ensure the well-being of Abraham's descendants. And it's not, you know, the thigh area of his body is not just happenstance. It's because of that area of the body. Okay? I actually made sure before I taught this Bible study, because I was like, is that what this means? This is kind of weird and uncomfortable. But everybody seems to kind of agree. Yeah, that's exactly what it meant. And it's something that we see done in other cultures. So, one thing I wanted to draw your attention to, let's see, verses 5 and 6. He tells him to go and find a wife among his kindred, and someone read verses 5 and 6 for us.
And the servant said to him, perhaps the woman will not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I take your son back to the land from which you came? But Abraham said to him, beware that you do not take my son back there.
Okay. Do you notice how clear Abraham is about staying in the promised land? He's very quick. No, my son doesn't leave this land to go back to where we came from. He stays here. I think this is one hint, and we'll see another one later that's even clearer, that at this point, Abraham has learned the lesson. Don't leave the land. The land is really important. This is the inheritance. Okay, so then Eliezer swears, he enters into the oath, and then he makes his way there. It says he goes into Mesopotamia to the city of Nahor. And let's see if there's a helpful map here. Okay, so he's down here. Let me see what this says. So, okay, so Eliezer starts out in Beersheba, and he goes all the way up here to where Nahor lives. Do you remember who Nahor is?
Uncle?
It is, yeah, it's kind of confusing. It's the uncle. You can see it back in chapter 11. It says, first of all, there are two Nahors.
Mm-hmm.
One is Abraham's uncle, and one is Abraham's grandfather. So one of Abraham's uncle was named after his grandfather. Okay? It says, when Nahor had lived 29 years, he became the father of Terah, and Nahor lived after the birth of Terah 119 years and had other sons and daughters. When Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Okay? So, Abram at that point he leaves his family way up here in this region and goes down south. He takes Lot, who is his nephew, that is Haran's son, his other brother's son, and then the third brother, Nahor, apparently stayed up there. And that's where now Eliezer is going to get a wife. So Abram has sent his servant to go find family members up in the north, way up in the north.
Do you
Let me
have
see.
a rough, like, how many miles is that? Do you know?
Let's see. So down here is our scale. This is 100 kilometers, and that's 100 miles. So we're miles people. Let's maybe I can measure it with this. Let's see. So it's about that far to the back button. Okay, so he starts down here. That's 100 miles. That's 100 miles. That's 100 miles. That's probably about 500 miles, maybe closer to 600 miles.
That's a
So
long way to walk.
he traveled, maybe he went by camel or
A
something.
long way.
But it
It's
was,
a long way to ride a camel too.
now the good news is this wouldn't have been a trek through like only desert. It looks like this might be an arid region up here, but it looks like there are little waterways all the way up there. In fact, that's probably why they have the route going right here and then making that little jagged piece, because right here is kind of a dead spot, a dry area where people wouldn't have traveled. Okay, so
Aren't you glad you live now?
I know.
Long
Are we
journey
glad
still.
we have cars with air conditioning? Now, if you get reading into the story, he comes north and he prays once he gets up there. Look at verse 12. And he said, "O Yahweh, God of my master." So this is chapter 24, verse 12. And he said, "O Yahweh, God of my master Abraham, grant me success today, I pray thee, and show steadfast love to my master Abraham." So steadfast love, in some of your translations, it might be something else like loving kindness, or do you have anything else there?
Kindness.
Just
Kindness. Okay. This is a word that is translated in many different ways because it's an incredibly important word. It comes up many times in the Old Testament, especially in the Psalms. And the word people, man, you go to a seminary, people will just say it during a sermon like it's nothing in Hebrew. And then they like to give you a lesson on how to make a cat noise in your throat because you say chesed, and you got to like hawk a loogie in your back. Sorry, that's not. You got to clear your throat. Chesed, and that is a term that's often translated steadfast love or loving kindness or mercy even. But what it is it's more like, I think many people would agree nowadays, maybe a better translation would be more like loyal love. That it is, I mean, we think of love primarily in terms of like affection or feeling. The point is, God's love, God, because of his love, he draws people into covenant relationship with him. So chesed is inseparable from the idea of the covenant. God shows chesed to the people he is in covenant with. Okay? So let me give you an example. This is one of my favorite examples. Find Hosea chapter 6. Ooh, this will be great for so many reasons. Let's see. Hosea is one of the early of the 12 prophets, if I remember correctly, but I think I already passed him. Where are you at, Hosea? Yeah, it's before Joel and Amos. Hosea chapter 6. So this is like many of the prophets. God is frustrated with his people because they've been wayward for a long time. And I'll start in someone read chapter 5, verse 15, and then read through chapter 6, verse 6.
I'll do it. I will return again to my place till they acknowledge their offense. Then they will seek my face. In their affliction, they will earnestly seek me. Come and let us return to the Lord, for he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us up. After 2 days he will revive us, and on the third day he will raise us up, that we might live in his sight. Let us know, let us pursue the knowledge of the Lord. His going forth is established as the morning. He will come to us like the rain, like the latter and former rain of the earth. O Ephraim, what shall I do to you? O Judah, what shall I do to you? For your faithfulness is like a morning cloud, and like the early dew it goes away. Therefore I have hewn them by the prophets. I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and your judgments are like light that goes forth. For I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings.
Okay. So I've got to stay on the chesed point for a second and then talk about a couple other things. In verse 4, he says, your love is like a morning cloud, or your faithfulness is like a morning cloud. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
That word is chesed. That's the same word, chesed. Chapter 6, verse 4. He says, what shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes early away. Basically, your your commitment to our covenant, our loving covenant, is like dew that disappears in the morning. Basically, you're not faithful. It doesn't last for long at all. You don't stay loyal to the covenant that you have with me. But then in verse 6, he says, for I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice. So steadfast love there is also the word chesed. And so he's saying, I desire covenant faithfulness. I want you to be faithful to me in this relationship. Basically, you cheat on me like, barely have we entered into marriage and you cheat on me. I want your covenant faithfulness to last for forever. And notice that the people's love is compared to a morning cloud or dew that disappears. Yahweh and his love is likened to spring rains, rain that always comes. It's like the morning. It also is like the sun that comes up. It always is dependable. God is always faithful. And so you have two water images. The people of God who are like dew that disappears in their faithfulness, and God's faithfulness that is everlasting, never goes away. It's like the morning sun rising, or like springs that come every year, rain that comes every year. Let me make sure. It's also really fun to think about. First of all, verse 6, Jesus himself quotes. And I believe it might be Matthew chapter 12, after that famous passage when Jesus says, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. You know that passage? Then he goes into the synagogue and he heals someone and they get really mad at him. And he tells the Pharisees and the rulers, he says, something like, have you not read, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. And we hear mercy, but what's behind that is he's quoting this passage in Hosea. I desire covenant faithfulness and not sacrifice. He's calling out the Pharisees for being unfaithful to the covenant with Yahweh publicly. He's embarrassing them. Also, did you notice at the beginning all that language of, he's stricken us, but he will revive us. Let's see, what does it say? He is torn that he may heal. He is stricken and he will bind us up. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will raise us up. I think when you're reading about the resurrection story, you're supposed to be thinking of that as a fulfillment of Hosea's prophecy. Jesus received the blows, the discipline on behalf of all the people of God who were unfaithful to his covenant, but he is also risen from the dead on the third day, in accordance with Hosea, among a number of other prophecies. Does that make sense? I'm trying to help you see how all of this is interconnected. This is where I just get so excited reading the Bible when you see these connections. And notice the water imagery again, that water is good. God's faithfulness, he's faithful, and so he's going to come like the spring rains. But the people's faithfulness is like morning dew, it goes away. So water is this, again, the symbol of goodness and God's presence and blessing. Any questions there? Or anything that didn't make sense? Okay. Just notice chapter 24, verse 7. Yahweh says to his servant, Yahweh, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my birth, and who spoke to me and swore to me, to your descendants I will give this land. He will send his angel before you. Okay? God, Yahweh will send his angel before Eliezer the servant. And now look in verse 40. This is when Eliezer is meeting Rebekah's family. He's meeting Laban and the whole family, and he's telling the whole story. We're basically hearing the story a second time. And when he tells the story in verse 40, he says, but he said to me, Yahweh, before whom I walk, will send his angel with you and prosper your way. And you shall take a wife for my son and for my kindred and from my father's house. So both times the angel of the Lord is mentioned. This is the same angel that met Hagar in the wilderness and spoke to her. And I've talked to you a little bit about how the angel of the Lord is a very specific angel and is normally spoken about as basically Yahweh on earth. So when Moses meets Yahweh in the burning bush, it says that it's the angel of the Lord in the burning bush. And then when Yahweh guides Israel through the wilderness in the pillar of fire and cloud, you remember that? The pillar of fire? It says that Yahweh is guiding them, but then at different points it says it's the angel of the Lord that's guiding them, angel of Yahweh. So many people, I included, consider the angel of the Lord basically the Son, God the Son, Jesus, before he became incarnate. And that he's active in the story all along. I mean, I don't think there's any 100% proof, and there are quite a few people who would disagree. But it seems to me that Jesus is very active in the whole story of salvation, even before he comes incarnate. He's also who encounters Abraham when he's about to kill Isaac on Mount Moriah and tells him to stop. So the angel of the Lord has been very active in the story. And chesed, or steadfast love, comes up multiple times in the chapter. In chapter 24, verse, oh goodness, that's a long verse, verse 14. At the very end of verse 14, he says, "By this I shall know that thou hast shown steadfast love to my master." So that's at the end of his prayer to God. The servant is praying to God, and he's saying, hey, basically, do what my master told me you would do, and prove your covenant faithfulness. Prove that you're going to stick with your covenant. And then if you look at verse 27, let's see, who is this talking? He's talking to Rebekah, who says, "We have both straw and provender enough and room to lodge in." The man bowed his head and worshipped Yahweh and said, "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master." So he meets Rebekah at the well, and he says, when she responds in the way that he's excited about, that he expects her to respond, then he erupts in praise. He worships God, and he says God has been faithful to his covenant promises, because here she is. I see it now. She's right in front of me. And notice, what does Isaac ask her to do when they're at the well? Or give him a drink, draw water for him. And then he, says, if she offers to water my camels as well, and then she does. What does Jesus do when he meets the woman at the well? He says, "Give me water." There's no denying that we're supposed to be seeing an echo of these stories in Genesis. I just think that's awesome. So the rest of the story, it's important to note that this is Laban, the family of Laban, and he's going to come back into the story one generation later when Isaac's son Jacob comes back to this family and deals with Laban, his uncle. And let's read just quickly. So the basic story is Isaac meets Rebekah at the well. She confirms that she is the one that he's going to get married to Isaac. She takes him back to Laban and the rest of the family, and then they kind of start negotiation. The servant tells the whole story, and then they decide whether or not she's going to go with them. And so they decide she's going to go back with them and marry Isaac. And then, let's see where this is. Maybe we can start reading verse 54. Someone read verse 54 through 57, I guess.
So just to be clear, though, first, this is like a first cousin.
Yeah, let's see. I guess it would be a first cousin, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Might make us a little uncomfortable, too. Yeah.
Little almost incest.
Right, right. So, on the one hand, we know, why was it such a big deal? We didn't read it explicitly, but at the beginning, Abraham says, "Do not take a wife for my son from the Canaanites." And by the Canaanites, he just means people found in this region. It's not a specific people. It don't take it from the Hittites, don't take it from the Amorites, don't take it from any of these other people groups. Go back and take it from my people, who are Arameans. They're a certain ethnic group. Why does this matter?
They don't want the intermarriage with enemy nations.
Right. So especially later in the story, as the story develops, it becomes clearer and clearer that getting married with people in different nations or tribes often creates issues. I mean, one, it often results in a political bond. You marry someone from a different tribe or a different nation, and all of a sudden you are supposed to be political allies. That's why it's like a really bad deal and a bad idea when Solomon gets married to the Pharaoh's daughter, I think, like an Egyptian, because he's basically made a political alliance with Egypt, and that makes God mad. God doesn't want Israel having. This is much later in Israel's history, but there's a point way later in the history with Ezra and Nehemiah when they come back to the land out of Babylon, and Ezra makes it abundantly clear, you know, basically, if you marry another woman, you're not an Israel. Or if you marry someone from another nation, you're not an Israelite anymore. So there is a concern throughout the story that they not have intermarriage with other tribes and nations around them, and half the time that's because they don't want to create political alliances with other groups. It brings them into worshiping other gods. It makes them dependent on other nations, and God wants them to be dependent on Him. But that's a potential explanation for why. But there's another potential explanation for why He wants him to go back to their own family. Can you think about it? This one still isn't clear to me, but multiple people I read is that it could just be that it's a strict effort to keep the blessing. The blessing has been promised to kind of Abraham's line and lineage, and they're trying to make sure that they stay, basically, that they don't stray too far away from his bloodline. So in a sense, it could be understood not just as like, they don't like them foreigners, because God actually cares a lot about the foreigners. All throughout the Old Testament, God does give them warnings about marrying people outside of their nation because of like those issues I mentioned. But He also very much cares for foreigners. It's not like foreigners are evil or something like that. So that's a potential explanation, but I think it might be more of they're trying to make sure that the blessing stays in the family by staying in the bloodline of Abraham. So I don't know. There's lots of things going on in this story that make us feel weird, right? Some guy makes a promise by putting his hand on another guy's groins. You know, there's also multiple wives. I mean, as we'll see in a minute, Abraham has, I don't know how many wives and how many concubines. Now, I think if you follow the story along, we'll get to that. But there are lots of things here that we would consider wrong, and it's a fair question to ask. How did we get from this to the understanding that we're supposed to have one wife and we're not supposed to marry our cousins? You know,
Sisters.
Or sisters, yeah, or most immediate, you know, all immediate family. But you know, honestly, I'd be hard pressed to see if I could find a biblical answer for why we can't marry family members. I've always, you know, anyways, that's a whole different conversation. Don't do it, just in case you were thinking about it. So
some religious marry family, like the Amish and Mennonites, they intermarry.
Wow.
First cousins are preference.
Really?
Of course, we see a lot of problems there too now.
Yeah.
So they are seeing that that's not so good.
Yeah. Okay. I wasn't aware of that about Amish and Mennonites. That's interesting.
And if there's a disease
Right.
that goes through the bloodlines, then it's multiplied.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think we've known for quite a while that, like, even with the first cousin, there's a exponential danger of like inheriting, like problems happening with the children.
My mother was Lutheran, and she didn't want anybody to have anything to do with Catholics. So.
Oh yeah, is that how you're applying this text? Don't marry other nations. Don't marry Catholics. Okay. Well, but you see the wisdom. There is a certain wisdom in, like, when you get married to someone, you're affected by them. I mean, if you get married to someone and you refuse to be changed by them, you're kind of a jerk. You know, like, marriage changes you. That's when I married Catherine, I basically was saying, I like you so much, I'm willing to not only risk, but welcome being changed by you. And I hope and she expressed to me that she was willing to be changed by me, that we were willing to become one flesh. And that means I don't get to say, this is my life, get away, I'm going to do things my way. We have to affect each other. We get to affect each other and be affected by each other. And so there is a wisdom all throughout the Bible. Don't get married to someone who's going to draw you away from God. So for a long time it was, don't get married to these other nations because they worship other gods. And God explicitly says, do not marry wives from other nations because they will draw you to worshiping their gods. And that's what happens to Solomon. He gets over 1,000 wives, and it says he worshiped all their gods.
He was busy.
He was. He had a lot of kids. So there is a wisdom there. And you could think of others. I think that it's like 2 Corinthians chapter 6, where Paul says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. Basically, don't get married to someone who's an unbeliever. And that happens quite frequently. Christians who think that they can maybe get married and change the other person to become a believer or something, and they're marrying out of romance or something, often not a good idea. There's just as much of a risk, perhaps more, that your spouse is going to draw you into unbelief. I mean, that kind of thing does happen. So I don't think it's all that terrible to be Roman Catholic. I love and respect many Roman Catholics. But yeah, there is wisdom in knowing that who you get married to is going to affect you.
I think what her deal was, is married Catholic,
Mm-hmm.
you'd be drawn into the Catholic Church.
Right.
And
my
your
mother didn't
children.
Believe what
Right.
they believed. And,
The Catholic, when you married a Catholic and you were a Protestant, you had to agree back in the day to raise your children.
Yeah.
Catholics.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Still do.
I think you still do. Yeah. There's all kinds of. I mean,
They're not as strict.
right.
Not as
Right.
strict.
Right.
and back then too, they were still under the belief of purgatory.
Oh, I think many Catholics still are, but that's another conversation for another day. We'll talk about Roman Catholicism another day.
Jewish religion too believes in staying within
Mm-hmm. Within the faith, yeah, and we have to acknowledge that there's some faith, there's some wisdom in that, But anyways, let's move on, and let's look at verse 62 with me. This is basically they're headed home. And it says, now Isaac had come from Be'er Lahai-roi and was dwelling in the Negev. Okay, so first of all, the Negev is in the south. I wonder, is there anything helpful on here? Let's see. So here's Be'er Lahai-roi. Here, it's very far in the south. This is actually not normally what we would consider Israel. Does anybody remember Be'er Lahai-roi? It came up earlier in the story with Hagar in chapter 16. It's when the first time that she gets sent, she runs away because Sarah's been oppressing her, Sarai at that point, and she's in the wilderness. And guess what? Look at chapter 16, verse 7. The angel of Yahweh, there he is again, found her by a spring of water. Surprise, surprise. I'm not being slow enough. Some of you are still flipping there. Chapter 16, verse 7. So the angel of Yahweh found her by a spring of water in the wilderness. So if we're paying attention, we're going, oh, water in the wilderness. This is a big deal. The spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, maid of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She said, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of Yahweh said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. So he finds her and, I should read the next part. Verse 10, the angel of Yahweh also said to her, I will so greatly multiply your descendants that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of Yahweh said to her, behold, you are with child and shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because Yahweh has given heed to your affliction. So someone keep reading from verse 12 to verse 14.
Be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees. For she said, here have I also here seen him who sees me. Therefore the well was called Be'er Lahai-roi. observe. It is between Kadesh and Bered.
Okay. Thank you. That's very good. So we have water, we have a well, and this is where she names that place Be'er Lahairoi, because that means, I believe it means like the God who sees. Or
Mine
you.
says the well of the living one who sees me.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't say Be'er Shel.
Yeah, so it went ahead and tried to
Yeah.
translate it for you.
So I would have missed that.
Yes, that's one of. So that is. There are all kinds of translations. Hers is a translation, but it's also kind of a paraphrase. They add in some extra stuff to help explain as she's reading what's going on. And some of yours, yeah, didn't refer to the place name. They just went ahead and translated it. But basically, the place was called something like the God who sees me or something. And so here it is again, and Isaac is dwelling in Be'er Lahairoi, and that's, according to this map, it's way down south. I'd be interested to see if maps always place it that far south, because that's not really in Canaan, and he should be in Canaan, so that kind of confuses me. But it also says he was dwelling in the Negeb. So the Negeb, it's fascinating. In Hebrew, the word Negeb is the name of a region in the south, and I don't know how large the region is, but it's probably about this area. But it's also often just translated the south, because that region was to the south of Israel where they lived. So I read Psalm 126 today in worship, or somebody did, or Chris did. And he says, restore our fortunes, Lord, as the water courses in the Negeb or in the south. Some of your translations said in the south. Mine said in the Negeb. And that's because, like I told you, this region, the Negeb in the south, is a region that can be arid and like a dry wilderness for much of the year, until at one point in the year the rains come and all of a sudden the desert turns into this lush, beautiful place of vegetation. So that is the region where Isaac is when Rebekah comes, and then Isaac went out to meditate in the field in the evening, and he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there were camels coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she alighted from the camel. I talked to you guys last time about how this phrase keeps getting repeated in Genesis when something really unique is happening. That they lift up their eyes and they see. When Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac, he lifted up his eyes and saw a ram caught in the thicket. And Hagar, when she is out in the wilderness, there's this idea of God sees her. So seeing is this kind of important theme. So I'm just trying to help you I know I'm kind of jumping around. I'm sorry. I know that it's hard to follow sometimes, but the idea is I want you to see how interconnected all of this is intentionally. By the guidance of the Holy Spirit, Moses wrote this in such a way that it is incredibly interconnected and beautifully designed, so that every time you see language about seeing, it could be significant. Anytime you see language about water or a spring or a well, there's probably some encounter about to happen that's really important. So let's see. Any questions at this point? We've got just a few minutes left. We can definitely finish the story about Abraham today. Perhaps begin the story of really Isaac. But if you look at chapter 25, right at the end of chapter 24, it says that Isaac loved his wife, and he was comforted in his mother's death. And I'm quite confident that word for love there also probably would have been chesed, although I could be wrong. Let me just see real quick. Let's see, what verse is that? That is verse 67. Okay, so let's see. He loved her. Nope, I was wrong. It's a different word. So, which actually helps the case even better. That word chesed is normally associated with the covenant, but this is a different word for love. Ahav is the word. Anyways, doesn't matter. So in chapter 25, Abraham takes another wife after Sarah has died, whose name was Keturah, and has a bunch of sons. And a couple of these names might be significant. So Midian is a word that comes up later. There's later a group of people who are either an ethnicity or kind of a nation, but there's a religion associated with them, and they seem to move around throughout the story of Israel. They're not really associated with one place. So I wonder if this is perhaps where that's connected to, but there's another place later on in Genesis where the Midianites are related to the Ishmaelites, people who come from Ishmael. And they're the ones who take Joseph into Egypt to be in Pharaoh's household and all that. You remember?
Moses marry a Midianite?
Yes, also. And Jethro, his father-in-law, was a Midianite priest. Okay. Also here, let's see. Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts. So it makes a point of saying, Abraham was a generous guy, and he made sure that every one that came from him was taken care of. And while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. So one thing, we've noticed this already, often the heirs of the promise, Abraham, Isaac, if someone lives too close to them, it results in conflict. And so originally Lot came with Abraham, remember? And then they had to separate because they multiplied, both of them were blessed, and they started getting in fights over wells. And then Abraham's doing so well in the country that Abimelech, who's a Philistine king, comes over and their people start fighting, the Philistines and Abraham's people, and they're fighting over wells. And then Abimelech comes to him, and they make a pact to keep separate and say, here, I'll take this area and I'll take this area. So God's always trying to preserve the room for the heirs of the blessing. And here Abraham knows how it works, and he sends the sons of his concubines off to get far enough away, and he sends them eastward. And that's another theme throughout the book. If you pay attention to how often somebody goes east. So Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, and they go east of Eden. Then Cain, when he's cursed after killing his brother Abel, he is sent east. People just get sent further and further east. What's in the east?
Wilderness.
Well, there's a couple answers to that question. There's the wilderness, so in one way it also means death. You could also wonder if part of the reason for that is here in the east is Babylon. And Babylon is both where the Tower of Babel was built, and it's later where the Israelites are made captives. And so, in many ways, the east is symbolic of death and captivity, right? It's far away from the garden and the Lord's presence, and it's closer to people and things that kill God's people. That's where Cain had to go, and he's a killer of people. So Abraham lives 175 years, breathed his last, died in a good old age, full of years. And his two sons bury him, Isaac and Ishmael. I'm in chapter 25, and I'm just kind of summarizing. And Abraham is buried on the same plot of land that Sarah was built, right? After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son, and Isaac dwelt at Beer-lahai-roi. Okay, so that area was kind of Isaac's stomping grounds. Now, then it goes through the descendants of Ishmael. And how many descendants does Ishmael have?
12.
12. And why is that significant? 12 tribes. It's significant for a couple reasons. Okay, yes. Okay, all of these are interconnected. So, first of all, God promises to give Isaac that 12, well, does he mention 12 nations coming from Isaac or from Abraham? I don't know if he does. But if you look in chapter 17, Abraham, this is one of the last times Abraham doesn't really get it, and he insists to God that God's blessing go to his son Ishmael, because he hasn't had Isaac yet. And God says, no, I'm not going to bless Ishmael. This is chapter 17, verse 19. God said, no, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him and make him fruitful and multiply him exceedingly. He shall be the father of 12 princes. Okay? So here we have 12. Again and again, if you're paying attention, God says something's going to happen, and it happens just how he says. 12 princes. I don't know if there's anything else we're saying. I know we're right at 5 o'clock. So it says, then Ishmael died, and they dwelt from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. I don't even know where that is. He settled over against all his people. It says it's opposite Egypt. So here's Egypt way down here. And it says that it's in Havilah. They dwelt from Havilah to Shur. And it says in the direction of Assyria. Assyria is way up here. Egypt's down here. Assyria is way up here. So I have no idea where they dwell. That's a pretty big area. I'm guessing it's somewhere up here. I don't know. Maybe
This is the little way to the northeast of Egypt.
Okay, so that could make sense. I mean, that could be somewhere over here. If that's the case, it's not too far from where Isaac was, because Isaac is somewhere down here.
Where's Assyria?
Assyria is way up here.
Well, it says a little way from Assyria.
Well, this is a...
It
Right.
says Egyptian border in the direction of Assyria.
Right, so here's Assyria. It literally says Assyria right here. And Ashur is right there. I don't know if that could be. Sure, let me see if there's anything. Yeah, I don't think there's really anything to tell us. Okay, so that pretty well sets us up. That finishes our discussion of Abraham. Next time, we will talk through the rest of chapter 25. We'll talk about, I intend to talk through 26 and 27, and if we're blessed by God, we will get into 28. And next Sunday is Palm Sunday. And the Sunday following will be Easter, which we, of course, won't have Bible study on Easter. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how long this study is going to last. It would have been nice to be done at Easter, you know. Are y'all interested? Do you want to keep this going until we get through all of Genesis, or would you rather just try and cap things off next week, and I could just try and string together some of the most famous stories in the rest of Genesis?
We're only halfway, right?
Yeah. Still a lot of Genesis.
Right. So we wouldn't get to discuss quite a few wonderful, very interesting things. The whole start of Israel. I mean, I could probably try and fly over some of the big stories like him wrestling with God and stuff, but
could you fly over?
It's a good question.
No way.
So I'm happy to keep going. I do want to finish sometime because I'd like to do some other Bible studies this year. So I'll plan on going on after Easter and finishing the book.
All year? Will it take all year to get through Genesis?
No, I mean, at the current rate we've been going about 3 to 4 chapters each time, and so we'd be done in 6 weeks or so. That's a very rough guess. But otherwise, I don't know. Maybe I'll try and just go a little bit faster.
Catherine looks doubtful.
I have a hard time slowing down.
When you start flipping to another part in the Bible, it'll say, "Stop, Daniel.
Yeah.
You can't go there.
You
have
can't-
to stay here."
You can't make a connection in another place. No. Okay. Well, let me pray for us. God, we bless you. We're so thankful to be together. Thank you for teaching us. I have perhaps confused or thrown a lot at them. Help to order all the information in our heads and in our hearts, and help us to gain a greater understanding of you, to know how what you say does come to pass, how faithful you are, even when our faithfulness is like a morning cloud that goes away. How you teach us about yourself, and you teach us to be faithful, and how patient you are in teaching us to be faithful and righteous. So many good lessons to learn, and how you are the source of life and blessing. Help us to meditate on these things this week as we learn to love you and love each other more. In Jesus' name, amen.